Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. We hope that you tuning in to listen to the Counselling Tutor Podcast are well too. You've caught us at episode 227. 3 stops on today's journey, starting off with Counselling I don't know what that was. Counselling fundamentals, and that's where we revisit the basis of what counselling is made up of. And today we're looking at the theory of transference and countertransference, something we visit often just in our chats, but today a focused dive into that. Then we look at focus on self, where we recognize you're the heart of your practice. Without us being okay, we can't be there in terms of being there as best we can for our clients. And today we're speaking about changing your supervisor. Comes a time when maybe that comes up and we need to consider changing supervisors. And then we go on to Practice Matters, where we dip our toe into what we may come across within the running of a practice. It can be the business of running the practice, the paperwork. But today we're looking at a presentation that may come into your counselling practice. And Quinn Dexter from the YouTube channel Autistic. I've got to get my mouth ready for that one, Rory. Autistic.
Yes.
Is joining us for part 2, accommodating autistic people as a therapist. And if you want to listen to part 1 of Quinn Dexter's talk, really worth visiting. You'll find that episode 226 of our podcast. But today, Rory, starting off with those foundations, transference, countertransference.
Well, it's the work of Uncle Freud, isn't it? Sigmund Freud gave us this notion that, we carry with us the ability to overlay a relationship that we may have had in the past onto someone we've just met. And this is done subconsciously. So, you might meet someone and find yourself, got in your tummy a little anxiety. And, you think, why am I so anxious? I've never seen this person before. We've only just met. Yeah, I'm very, very anxious. And it might be they remind you of someone who's made you anxious in the past. It could be a teacher or someone you've met in work, a former colleague, or a former boss, if you like. And sometimes it can really affect the relationship you have with the new person, because you're bringing in aspects of a past relationship. And that effect is sometimes referred to as countertransference. So let me just kind of elucidate on that. If you've had a relationship with someone in the past, say with a beard, I have a beard, say with a beard, and then you meet someone new with a beard, and you feel yourself feeling really, really awkward, and you don't really want to meet this person. It's very, very, very possible that you might react to the new person in the way you reacted to the other person, the first person who caused you the difficulty. And that's called counter-transference. And here's the thing, Ken, it's totally subconscious. Sometimes we don't know that it's happening. We don't know the reason for it. But once it's explained, it becomes clear. People say, do you know, that's exactly what it is. It reminds me of, could be someone off the TV that played a real baddie in a detective, and all of a sudden you're projecting those feelings onto someone new.
Yeah, it's an important theory to understand because it shows itself again and again. And of course, the reason we need to understand it is to check ourselves and watch that we're not acting from a position of counter-transference within the client, with our clients within the therapy room. If we are as you said, Rory, transference itself is invisible. So we're going to use the scenario of a client coming in, sitting opposite us, and subconsciously that links into something from our past. Now, there is the transference, and we may have a feeling within ourselves, but it's when we react to that, when we start acting based on that feeling, that is the countertransference. And then, of course, we're not there with that client 100%. Part of us is with somebody from our past, and we don't see it. And a good supervisor will look out for transference and countertransference within your interactions with your clients. But it is something that comes up all the time. It's happening to all of us every day pretty much when we're going about our lives, but we don't see it. And I think you put it really nicely, Rory, you can meet someone and you can say, I don't know what it is, but, and it can also be positive. Transference is not always a negative phenomenon. I mean, we can meet someone and go, I don't know what it is, but I really like that person. I really like who that person is. And it can be transferential as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that could be kind of disappointing because you might meet someone and the transference that you're picking up is by someone you've had a really great relationship with, and the new person maybe you don't get along with too well, and that can cause a bit of conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a confusion, transference, countertransference, and usually we pick it up by our emotions. So it's not something we can cognitively reason with. We check our emotions when we're in the therapy room, and if anything is coming up for us and we're not quite sure why that is, it may be an indicator of transference. We may be acting from a position of countertransference, and it's certainly something to take into supervision and say, this client said such a thing, they're presented like such a thing, and I don't know what it is, but I felt such a thing. And then it can be explored, because exploration of the transference and countertransference takes it from being subconscious, in other words, not seen and processing behind the scenes, as it were, behind that curtain. Once that curtain is open and we can see it, we can start dealing with it. And a good supervisor will kind of try and link it to who does this person maybe remind you of? What was that relationship with that person? Is this person that person? And of course, the logical answer, now that we can cognitively see it, is no. And then you can change it. It takes the power out of the transference. Once it's seen, it can't be unseen again.
Yeah, I like that point. Yeah, and what you're speaking to is reworking the transference. So, in the therapy room, should a client say to you, you remind me of somebody. I think a switched on therapist may say, tell me a little bit about who I remind you of. And you can get the sense of if there's some transference going on. And then we can do what we call reworking the transference, where we say, I really hear that I look like, your uncle, but actually I'm Rory. I'm a different person. And just to bring it into the here and now. And there's one thing I want to say about transference that sometimes gets a bit missed. A lot of people in the person-centered world said, we don't talk about transference. We never mention transference in person-centered therapy. Actually, that's not quite true. Carl Rogers wrote, I think, about a chapter about transference and countertransference in client-centered therapy. He totally acknowledged it. What he did say was that, unlike the very strict old-time Freudian psychoanalysts, like maybe a bow tie, maybe sitting there with someone on the couch, what we do is we don't resist it. We kind of work with it. And, I guess to some extent, sometimes that's forgotten, but it is a phenomena. And I suppose it's a biological phenomena as well, because it's often referred to as we're biological time machines. Of course, we're going to pick up on relationships of the past as a survival mechanism. So if we meet the same person in the future or someone like them, our subconscious processes say, is this going to be the same situation? So I think it's something that should be taught in all counselling, and it's very useful, and it's certainly something that comes up in supervision. I don't know what your experience is, Ken, but it comes up a lot as a supervisor.
Yeah, I mean, there's no secret to the fact that at Counselling Tutor, we train clinical supervisors. And one of the areas we dig into deeply is transference. It's part of the supervision model. You will look out for the transference, and you may even work with the transference, which I'm not going to cover here because it is a little bit more advanced. But if you are interested in training to become a supervisor, check out counsellingtutor.com. The information is on that homepage. And then you can join our waiting list, because it is a it's online, but it is an in-person online with the tutors actually there, delivered training course. So there is a waiting list on that. But if that interests you. And I kind of just wanted to use a real life example as we kind of back out of this, Rory, from my own life. So I look back to the very first time I met my now father-in-law. So at the time, he was not my father-in-law. He was my girlfriend's dad. And the very first time I met him, I had a feeling of dis-ease, a big feeling of dis-ease. I was almost frightened. I almost wanted to avoid being in his company. And the interesting thing was, when I kind of looked at that, he couldn't have been kinder. He couldn't have been more welcoming. He was smiling. He was open, approachable. So nothing from him was putting off that feeling that I was feeling, but I really felt a dis-ease. And when I was going through it, I thought, well, maybe this is a logical way to feel with a girlfriend's dad. Maybe it's because he's older than me, so it's a respect for him being further down the road. But when I really looked into it, I realized that he looked similar to the sergeant major that we had, our residential sergeant major, Rory, when I was doing my conscription military service when back in South Africa. And our residential sergeant major was not a person you wanted to be in front of under any circumstances. He was a very shouty man, well, as you would expect of a regimental sergeant major. And once I was able to see that and differentiate and go, but he's not the sergeant major, he is, at the time, my girlfriend's dad, all of that dissipated.
Yes, and I think that's a really great example. And there is another example in my super duper handout, which you can find at podcast episode 227. How do you get that? Couldn't be simpler. You go to counsellingtutor.com, you click on the podcast tab, you find episode 227, and you can download that handout, which gives my experience of transference when working with a student.
Yep. Now, if you're listening to our podcast, you're a regular listener to our podcast, and we get so many emails saying, I listen to your podcast. I listen to you and Rory all the time when I'm walking the dog or driving the car or whatever it may be. If you haven't visited our website, counsellingtutor.com, do yourself a favor. Not only are all these handouts there, but it is actually a search engine on our website for anything counseling related. So if you're a student specifically, you have a bit of theory or a concept or a skill that you're looking at within your training, go to counsellingtutor.com, scroll down on that front page, and you're going to see a little search engine there. Put in the search term, because we have a lot of really well-written, academically robust articles that will cover the main theories and skills used in counseling. So go and check that out. So remember, if you want to get Rory's handout, counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, episode 227, go and get it. Transference, Countertransference is quite a robust handout. It's academically written, gives a really interesting view on transference and countertransference. So whatever your level is, go and get that. It's a good handout to have. So backing out of, I guess, those counselling foundations, Rory, into that focus on self and changing your supervisor.
Yes, and this is a question we get asked a lot on our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, knock on the door, and our caring moderation team, our lovely moderation team, will let you in, and you can join thousands of like-minded people discussing the world of counselling and psychotherapy. We have students, we have tutors, we have qualified colleagues, we have lecturers, all talking about the issues of the day and issues in counselling and psychotherapy. And one that comes up quite often is changing your supervisor. And, some people say, I need to change my supervisor. And I think changing your supervisor is a good thing. Certainly as a supervisor myself, I can think of two former supervisees who've changed their supervisor as their practice has developed and gone to a supervisor with a different skill set. And one in particular was someone who started off seeing individuals and then trained to be a couples counsellor, and then decided that they wanted supervision with a couples counsellor. And I think that, thinking about changing your supervisor is a really good thing. And here's the thing, our world has changed over the last few years with the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. A lot of people have gone online to work online, and they've stayed working online either by phone or by video. And you really need a supervisor who has those skills, who understands the online world and the psychological phenomena which the online world brings. And I think a lot of people change the supervisor to adapt, as my former supervisor did, to their new way of practicing, which is online.
Yeah. And I think that's one reason why somebody may change supervisor. So you are working within an area, or if you're working with technology, as Rory said, you would want to work with a supervisor who has training in that area. If you just now start seeing, you've just graduated your couples counseling course and you're now seeing couples, you would hope that you're going to a supervisor who understands couples work and can be there to support you in your practice. But of course, there's other reasons why you might change your supervisor without having to change your modality. And it may be that you feel you're looking for something different. Maybe you're not getting all you need out of supervision. Maybe you're looking for a little more challenge. Maybe you're looking for a little less challenge and a little bit more support. It depends on your journey. So I guess changing a supervisor, there's two sides to this. One is I need to change my supervisor now because something's going on for you and you may be not 100% satisfied with what is going on. But the other side of that is, but I'm really happy with my supervisor. I've been seeing them for 7 years and we get together and it's all lovely. And it's, when it's too comfortable, maybe that's another indicator of, hold on a second, because supervision, yes, it is supposed to be there to support you and who you are, but there isn't a challenge element. I mean, good supervision improves your practice. It's what it's there for. We're taking in the presentations that we come across within our practice. We're taking it to a peer who is specialist trained, who is further down the road than we are. And we get feedback. We get pointed in areas where we should be doing our CPD. It challenges us, and within that challenge is growth. So I guess there's a number of different reasons why one might consider changing supervisor. And sometimes you might have more than one supervisor. And this is an interesting one. Because Rory, you went into this speaking about how times have changed and there's a lot more online working now. If you look to the ethical guidelines of your ethical body, chances are they suggest if you're working with technology that you should be getting supervision from a supervisor who is trained in working with technology. So if you're working online, you want to have a supervisor who understands that, as Rory's already said. But it may well be that you just take your online work to a supervisor who you may meet online and over a video conferencing software like Zoom or something like that. And you will take just your online work to that supervisor. And you may take your face-to-face work to a different supervisor. And I think that's a bit of a change, because if we look back in time, I think traditionally, and of course I can't speak for everyone, you would kind of tend just to have the one supervisor. But now we got more than one. Many have more than one.
Yes, it's becoming quite the norm now, and certainly as counselling and psychotherapy has moved into very specialised areas. I'm thinking of EDMR, eye movement therapy, as it's sometimes called. You would need a supervisor that's a specialist in that area. So yes, it's not unusual, certainly for qualified colleagues, to have one supervisor for one area, couples, EDMR, CBT maybe, and another for their person-centered practice. I think the only consideration is, considering who you're going to take to those different supervisors. I could think that there could be some difficulty if you took the same client to 2 or 3 different supervisors, because you may get different views, and that could be confusing. But yes, it's really an unspoken change in our profession. It's something that, I know when I qualified, it was something that just didn't happen. One supervisor was a do-all supervisor, and now, unless they're trained in these modalities, people may use one or more supervisors.
Big tick next to that point you raised, Rory, that you would only take one client presentation to one supervisor. Crossing that over, getting 2 different views on something can be very confusing for you as the practitioner. There may be a conflict because we all see things differently. And it's not that one is right and one is wrong. It may be just 2 different ways of working with something. But if you're sat with that conflict within you, that may present itself within your therapy room to your client. And another area to consider here is if you're still studying, if you can, it is best practice to have one supervisor, because your supervisor is asked to be part of your study journey. They're going to be writing reports on you. And of course, there is provision to have 2 different reports coming in, but not all of the systems at the moment are set up for that. It will be a letter from your supervisor, a report from your supervisor, as opposed to letters and reports from your supervisors. But if you're qualified and you are working, let's say online, go out, get yourself an online supervisor. If your supervisor is not trained to manage your online practice, I'm going to give a shout out here for counsellingsupervisors.co.uk. So that's counsellingsupervisors.co.uk. That is a supervision directory set up by Counselling Tutor, by Rory and myself. We did it as a product at the end of our supervision training for supervisors who are qualified to work online. All of the supervisors within that directory have been vetted. Of course, their qualifications have been checked that they are qualified not just to supervise, but to supervise online practice. So if you're interested in that, go to counsellingsupervisors.co.uk. The link is also in the show notes of today.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that it goes without saying that supervision is the beating heart of our profession. It's where as Robin Showhart famously said, the profession can breathe. You can go and you can talk about all aspects of your practice in a supportive way, and I think it kind of makes maybe our profession a little bit unusual, because in terms of supervision, it shouldn't be a deficit model. It should be talking about, strengths-based model and looking at building your professional formation, your professional skills, and helping you develop your confidence as a practitioner in service of your clients.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess the challenge is asking, are you getting everything you need from supervision? If you go back over some of our previous podcasts pretty recently, we've spoken about what you should be looking for from supervision, what good supervision looks like, and I guess we need to check in with ourselves from time to time as part of our professional process and our obligation to our clients, and ask that question: am I getting what I need out of my supervision right now? Am I growing? Am I seeing a growth in my practice? It's a call we make for ourselves, I guess.
Absolutely, and I, on a final kind of note, I think that maybe, I know a lot of students move supervisors when they graduate, because the supervision they get, as students may not quite kind of fit for them when they go when they become qualified colleagues. It's not always the case, I have to say, but I do hear a lot of students when they graduate, in a few months afterwards, then go on to change their supervisor. Just an observation. It's not an ethical diktat or anything like that.
Yeah, and as we've said on a number of occasions, it's part of a portfolio career, adding supervision training to who you are. When you mature in your practice, there comes a time that you can be there for other practitioners and take supervision training. And if you're interested in training as a supervisor, maybe if that time feels right for you, then visit counsellingtutor.com, because we certainly offer supervision training. You can join up with that waiting list, and we'll give you the updates and tell you about our training, and you can see if it's a fit for you. So all takes place online. There is a self-directed learning element, and of course the tutor-led sessions takes, I would say, about a year, including your placement, to become a supervisor. It's a pretty robust training program. Information, counsellingtutor.com. There it is. So that is our focus on self. And we now go into Practice Matters. That's where we dip the toe into practice. Rory, this is part 2 today. So if you haven't listened to part 1 of Quinn Dexter's interview, then you want to go to episode 226 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. But in 227, Rory, you spoke to Quinn about accommodating autistic people as a therapist.
Yes, so in this fascinating second part of this 2-part interview, I asked Quinn, what do therapists need to do to accommodate neurodiverse people? And this is what he had to say.
Well, the first one that most people think of is environment. It's an obvious one. What's surprising is that until maybe 10 years ago, the idea of autistic sensory differences was something that we ourselves knew about within the community, but professionals generally didn't acknowledge. And it's still not considered part of the diagnostic criteria, although a lot of people do bear it in mind. But everybody seems to know it. Where it gets awkward is that whilst there are generic sensory considerations that you can use to make your venue more accommodating, they're all going to be unique to the individual. A good example, I spoke to somebody recently who was diagnosed as an adult, who told me about how when they went for their diagnostic appointment, there was a ticking clock in the waiting room. And that was a major frustration to them. Now, to me, a ticking clock's actually very soothing. I actually have analog clocks in every room in the house because that ticking actually is, for me, something which helps me regulate, I suppose is the best way to put it. Lots of us are very sensitive to the hum of electricity, for instance, just the sound of electricity going through wires that most neurotypical people can't hear. A lot of autistic people can. But when you take it to things that you can hear, like, say, a fridge or the cooling fan on a computer, to a lot of autistic people, that might be like somebody being in the corner of the room drilling into the wall. It can be incredibly distracting. So certainly that's something that is worthwhile considering, because although it's not uniform, that one is quite common. But in general terms, from environment, it's reducing the noise pollution, avoiding overhead lighting, particularly fluorescence. The flickering of fluorescence is something that a lot of us are quite sensitive to. We do perceive it consciously. Having the door open or closed is another one. Your default is probably going to be to close the door for privacy, which is perfectly understandable, and we'll want the privacy as much as anybody else. But a lot of people don't feel comfortable with closed doors. So it might be an idea to think about that if you are having somebody autistic to come to see you, to perhaps make sure that the waiting room is clear when they're there, or if there's reception staff of any sort, maybe they can go off for a coffee break while they're there. And the same goes for seating. I mean, if you can have a choice of seating, that's ideal. Some of us may not want to sit down. Some people do their best thinking when they're on their feet. And so if that's the case, let them do that. I mean, obviously, a lot of your listeners will do that sort of thing anyway. But it's definitely a paramount concern when you've got somebody autistic in there. More important than that, though, is thinking about how you communicate. A lot of autistic people don't get on very well with euphemism or metonymy. And if you do use either of those, or analogies or colloquialisms, do be prepared to explain them, because it may not seem obvious. If you were to describe, say, busybodies in business as being suits, they may not understand that you mean business people. They may be thinking of literally animated suits. It might confuse some people. I mean, although there are a few aphantasic autistic people, it's not something that's commonplace amongst us. But the idea of taking things literally comes from that sometimes we use euphemisms and colloquialisms that don't actually make sense in context in the conversation. And whereas two people who know each other well or come from the same culture might understand it, somebody who's autistic, or for that matter from another culture, might not get it. So do be prepared to explain things that way. And we will have a lot of questions as you go through. A lot of the things you'll say to us, we will ask you for clarity. But also is to understand the honesty that you'll get from most of us. If we don't say something, or if we say we don't know, it'll generally be because we don't know. It's not going to be because we're hiding something or we're embarrassed about something. We don't know, or we don't know what it is you're trying to get out of us, or trying to get us to open up about. What you will often find with us is that the candor that you will get from an autistic person is way more than you would get from the average neurotypical person you're going to be seeing. We tend to be very straight about things. Honesty it's often misrepresented. I always describe it as autistic veracity, because that kind of sums up the whole subject. We tend to be very honest by default. We don't like lies, and what constitutes a lie might not be what you think of as a lie. A lie is anything which is untrue. Now, that can be anything from sycophancy to fraud. Anything which isn't quantifiably true, that can't be verified or proved, technically speaking, is a lie. Now, our world functions on lies. Lies are everywhere. There is a certain level of dishonesty which we have chosen as a society to accept. We accept that politicians lie all the time. We accept that advertisers exaggerate all the time. Fiction is a lie, but it's a lie that we understand. It's a lie that we can work with. And there is actually a myth that autistic people can't get fiction, and that's absolute rot. If you go to any science fiction convention and chuck a penny, and you'll hit 10 autists straight away, I tell you. In fact, the last podcast I did was a science fiction podcast, all about the fact that so many autistic people are into science fiction. Sorry, I'm just getting my train of thought again. So yeah, as I say, there's autistic candor will catch people out an awful lot. Also, our emotional makeup can be very different. About half of autistic people are alexithemic, and that's going to factor into how we relate to anybody in a mental health care profession, because we're often going to be asked how we feel about things, and we will not often be able to express that, even if we're not one of that 50% who are alexithemic and we're on the other side. Finding words that will convey how we feel accurately to yourself might not be straightforward. I mean, myself, my channel and everything I do outside of my day job is communication, and people think of me as a pretty good communicator. But as I actually mentioned in the video I've got coming out this week, I was constantly punished as a child for being a fussy eater. The dentist used to have a go at my mum for letting me eat sweets all the time, because all my molars were rotten all the time. And I got punished for it. My mum thought I was eating sweets behind her back. My younger brother used to steal money from her purse, but I always got the blame for it, because she assumed that I was stealing that money to go and spend on sweets, which were then rotting my teeth, that the dentist was then having a go at her about. It took me until I was nearly 40 to explain to a doctor exactly what was going on in my life with my digestion, my eating habits. And they put me for the appropriate tests that proved that actually my stomach doesn't empty properly. And I've had acid reflux all my life. So all those punishments, all those assumptions that were made were based on preconceptions about naughty children, and the fact that I couldn't express it. I'd heard about heartburn all my life, but I had no idea that what I was experiencing was actually indigestion. And so it took me till I was nearly 40 to get that across. And it was a straightforward prescription of ranitidine and then omeprazole to calm the acid. And there are other tablets I can take to make my stomach empty. If that had been recognized when I was a kid, it would have not only saved me a lot of physical pain, but it would have saved me an awful lot of heartache, and it would have helped prevent some of the wedges that were driven in between myself and my family when I was younger. So, the fact that we can't always get our point across isn't just a question of what we're saying, it's a question of how we're being listened to. And those listening skills that people in these professions that we're talking about have worked so hard to develop, perhaps you're going to need to go back to the drawing board on some of them.
Yes.
And that's because we're not the same. We think differently. Our emotions are different, our senses are different, and our relationship with the truth is very, very different. And adjusting to that is going to be probably the most important thing if you are seeing an autistic client. And just as a bit of rampant self-promotion here, I've actually got a series on the autistic verbal spectrum. and on autism and relationships, which, quite honestly, for anybody who's thinking of or has autistic clients, would be absolutely invaluable, because it talks about our thoughts from the inside, not the external, the internal autistic experience and how that relates to the neurotypical one. I've spent 50 years studying neurotypicals, so I wouldn't say that I know everything by any means, but I've got a better handle than I used to. And it does help a lot by me, in some ways, acting as interpreter between the two camps, as it were, at times.
I mean, I think that's so useful. And that you've kind of answered my next question, that if you suspect a client is on the autistic, is autistic, or meted them, how you adjust accordingly. And I think you've really covered that, to try and understand the world view of someone who is autistic. Now, autism is traditionally understood via a triad of impairment, i.e. deficits of communication, empathy, restrictive interests, and the need for routine and repetition. How can therapists be sensitive to this in practice?
Okay. I already mentioned about empathy and the double empathy problem earlier on. When it comes to the triad of impairment, best way to be sensitive to it is to ignore it. It's to close that book and never look at it again. It's a redundant concept from an autistic point of view. The autistic mind is very different to the one that was imagined by the people who defined that triad decades ago. Back then, autistic people didn't know each other. We couldn't communicate. The only time one autist would meet another autist was in a care setting or a special school, where we had no power and very little agency. We weren't able to build meaningful relationships with other people who shared our way of interacting in the world. When we tried, it was seen as a challenge to the orthodoxy, and we were generally punished and silenced. I've got a number of friends, one of whom wrote a book recently, who went through the system in the 60s, 70s and 80s, not just here, but in the US, in Australia. Understandably, most of my contacts are English speaking, not all of them. But I hear tales like that from them so often. One or two were able to build friendships with other autists, but most who did were separated the moment they showed any sign of working together. And that all started to change in the 90s because the internet came along. Those of us like myself who started using it in the early World Wide Web days, mid-90s, or even back further when it was bulletin boards, we started to talk to each other, and we realized that we had a lot more in common with each other than a diagnosis. By sharing our experiences and respecting other people like us, that's something that a lot of us had never experienced up until that point, being listened to and being believed. We started to build a picture of our minds from the inside out rather than the outside in. Now, I know this may sound a bit controversial, but quite honestly, the majority of the expert knowledge about autistic people currently in existence today is not psychology, it's zoology. It's no different from studying an animal without actually being able to ask the animal's point of view. It's outside observation, experimentation, statistics. It's not an insight into our minds, because even those who have bothered to ask us either generally haven't paid sufficient attention, or they've not been able to accept or even comprehend some of the answers we've given. The autism triad of impairments is based on the assumption that autistic means broken. But what a few decades of autistic and other neurodivergent people talking to each other has revealed is that we're no more broken than the average neurotypical person, but we are different. So instead of looking at the autism triad, there's an alternative autistic triad, the one we've recognized ourselves from within. And I've touched on that already. It's that our senses work differently from the average non-autistic person. So we may be more or less sensitive to specific stimuli. It means our picture of the world might be richer in some ways, duller in others, understimulating or overstimulating. Or we may even glean sensory information that the average individual can't detect, like the hearing electricity I mentioned earlier on, or even supplementary information in the form of synesthesia. synesthesia isn't part of autism, but there are a lot of autistic synesthetes. There are estimates ranging from about 10 or 15%. And that can be unusual in its own way. I experience something which it's not very well known, but it's known as ticker tape synesthesia. When I speak and when people speak to me, I see subtitles. I don't see them superimposed on my vision. I'm aware of them. So to me, speech translates into written word on the fly. The only time I actually don't see that is when I watch something on television or watch a movie with subtitles. It's one of the reasons I put subtitles on, because it turns that off. So when there's actual words on the screen that correspond to the spoken word, but as soon as you get that thing, because a lot of subtitles will abbreviate from the spoken word, and when they abbreviate, it flashes up again. So it's quite an intriguing one. But we're all familiar with the idea of synesthesia in sort of classic things of being able to see colours from music, or getting textures from tastes and smells. That's another layer of sensory information, and that's something which can help some autistic people be very, very discerning about things. The third part of it, though, is the veracity that I mentioned earlier on. We tend to have a very specific relationship with the truth. It gets misrepresented as black and white thinking, as a lack of tact, as emotional immaturity or inappropriate behavior. But most of the time, it's actually us just being candid or telling a truth that somebody else doesn't want us to tell or doesn't want to hear. Emotions, they're an important part of the triad as well. It is senses, emotions, and veracity. Autistic emotions do tend to work slightly differently, just because so many of us are alexithemic. But even then, our manifestation of alexithemia may be more complex than what people expect. It's not just that we can't necessarily put the right words to the emotion we're feeling. It can be in the form of delayed emotions, overwhelming floods of emotion, hyper-empathy to the plight or the joy of others, or even having insight into people's motivations that they prefer hidden. Some of us are very, very good at spotting deception when other people are being taken in. Quite apart from the image that there is of autistic people being very gullible. Yes, some of us are. We naturally default to believe, as we said about empathy earlier on, because we're ourselves, generally speaking, very honest and very straightforward in our intents. We expect other people to be until they prove otherwise. And for some of us, it's got to the point where we've been so used to being disappointed, so used to being deceived, that we start to expect it from everybody, because it's easier to think that of everyone than it is to try and discern between who is and who isn't. But generally speaking, that ability to spot somebody who's not being straight with us is very, very common. And unfortunately, a lot of people who want us to believe that they're being honest with us, not mentioning any Mr. Johnsons or anything, are actually lying through their teeth all the time. But they'll tell us, and we're expected to believe, because they're in authority or they have that kind of relationship with us where we can't criticize them. They will expect us to take them at face value, even when they are blatantly lying through their teeth. So there's a lot that we see within the autistic triad that, if you understand it, will help you to understand the autistic mind and any autistic clients or patients a lot better. But if you go in with the frame of mind of its impairments, then you're really on a hiding to nothing. You're setting yourself up for failure. If you're going to help somebody to have a better future, if you're going to help them to get through difficult times, you need to be able to relate to them on their level. And as we talked about with radical empathy, that can be very, very difficult when you're dealing with somebody who's essentially immoral or antisocial in their behavior. A lot of what you see in autistic people isn't antisocial or asocial. It's a different kind of social. The fact that when you get a bunch of autistic people together, they can, generally speaking, get on well in a way that we never can if we were put into an equivalent sized group of neurotypical people, is evidence of that. And the same goes the other way around. If you put a neurotypical person into a bunch of autists, they will generally feel very awkward and won't know what to do or what to say. So if we can get around that and have it so that we've got people who understand that each side is different and be accommodating to each other, instead of it being as it is in the world today, where autists are expected to accommodate the neurotypical world and that's it. then you could go a long way forward. But we don't see that at the moment. But yeah, I think going back to where the question was, abandon the autism triad of impairment and instead look at the autistic triad of distinctions.
I think that's a really useful point to finish that kind of topic on. One final question: what would you personally look for in a counsellor or therapist if you needed one?
I'll tell you a little story. A couple of months ago, a psychiatrist in another country who runs a group practice approached me asking for help attracting autistic clients. And first thing I suggested was, well, get an autistic therapist on your books. I don't know what their arrangement was, whether it be some sort of partnership or whether they'd hire, but get an autistic therapist in. And she just said straight away, there aren't any. Now, I know quite a lot, but most of them have separate social media accounts to talk about the autistic side of their lives. They don't want to be identified as autistic in their professional life. They fear exposure because they see the way autistic people are routinely treated within the mental health system. We're not taken seriously, and they do need to be taken seriously. So the way a lot of approached it is to keep quiet about their diagnosis, but do what they can to change attitudes and enhance knowledge from within, in secret, as it were. They're, if you like, they're sleeper agents, moles within the system. But the fact that they find it such a scary prospect, actually opening up, coming out of the autistic closet, as it were, is quite scary. Now, I've had bad experiences with counselling before. I mentioned that earlier on. However optimistic I may start out at the beginning of it, no matter how qualified or experienced the counsellor, psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever their profession may be, it usually comes down to them in some way trying to alter my worldview in the same way that every parent, teacher, every boss, doctor, casual acquaintance and Facebook expert has done. They want me to see things from their non-autistic point of view rather than try to understand mine or even meet in the middle. I have needed counselling many times in the past, and most times I've given up on it because it just wasn't fit for purpose. And yeah, having an opportunity to talk to people who are in that profession right now is, it's a tremendous privilege, but it's something that I'm really glad to do, because there's such a huge knowledge gap out there. If you want to be cynical about it, sort of base instincts, you could say there's a hell of a lot of money to be made in understanding autistic minds and catering to our needs. But from a more ethical perspective, there's 2 or 3% of the population out there screaming for help and not getting it. And any of your listeners could put themselves in that position to be able to help. So right now, at this point in time, if I were looking for a counsellor or therapist, I'd be looking for somebody who was autistic. But I don't want that to always be the case. I'd like to think that at some point in the coming years, there'll be a healthy cohort of neurotypical professionals who work alongside their neurodivergent counterparts with a view that our differences are part of natural human diversity rather than deficiency, impairment, or deficit. What I look for is the understanding that the neurotypical way isn't the right way or the normal way. It's just the majority understanding in your specific culture, and other ways are equally valid. I think, probably to sum it up, I've learned the hard way that the word normal is very useful in geometry or statistics, but it doesn't apply to people.
Well, I think on those really profound words, and I think anybody listening to this will hear the need for extended empathy to really try to understand a different prism, a different frame of reference. Quinn Dexter, thank you so much for joining us.
Rory.
Big thank you to Quinn Dexter from Autistic and for you, Rory, for taking the time to do that interview. I've loved both parts of Quinn's interviews. I think it's honest, it's from the heart, it's spoken from experience, but also being kind of submerged in the world of neurodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a growing awareness. Our world is expanding our awareness of difference, and neurodiversity is one of those differences which therapists, need and should work hard to accommodate and try and meet that person, at either a relational depth or in a more practical way of making sure that they get the service that they want.
More information from Quinn. You want
Yes.
to go and check out his YouTube channel. You can get a link directly to Autistic YouTube channel from our show notes page. Go to counsellingtutor.com, podcast tab, episode 227. All the notes are there. You can get today's handout there. All the links we've spoken about to training, to the supervision directory, it's all there. But there's also a link to Quinn Dexter's YouTube channel. As a working professional, that is a channel that is worth subscribing to. He shares so much information. Rory, that's a mouthful. This has been episode 227, hasn't it, of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Absolutely. We started off with Counselling Foundations, where we talked about our old friend, transference, and countertransference indeed. And then on Focus on Self, we talked about changing your supervisor, maybe looking for a supervisor that matches your practice where it is at the moment. And then finally, that wonderful second part interview with Quinn Dexter, who talks about how therapists should adapt their practice to meet and work with people with neurodiversity. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.